On his wedding day, billionaire Rodrigo Albuquerque was moments from sealing his perfect life until a 9-year-old girl crashed the ceremony, claiming to be his daughter. As the past collides with the present, he must face a choice: power, or the family he abandoned. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand imperial hall gleamed with thousands of white flowers. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over guests dressed in luxurious attire. It was the wedding of the year. Rodrigo Albuquerque, a billionaire real estate mogul, was about to seal his union with Isabella Mura, a stunning socialite. Rodrigo adjusted his silk tie one last time before the mirror. At 42, he had everything he'd ever wanted: a booming real estate empire, the most beautiful woman in São Paulo about to become his wife, and connections with the most powerful people in Brazil. "5 minutes, sir," said his assistant, poking his head through the door. Rodrigo nodded, taking a deep breath. Something felt off, but he pushed the feeling away. This was his moment of triumph, the final piece in his perfect life puzzle. "You look worried," said Carlos, his best man and business partner. "Having second thoughts?" "Don't be ridiculous," Rodrigo replied sharply. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Meanwhile, across town in a rundown apartment building, Maria Oliveira clutched a crumpled newspaper featuring Rodrigo and Isabella's engagement announcement. Tears streamed down her face as her daughter Lucia watched quietly from the doorway. "Mama, why are you crying?" the 9-year-old girl asked, her big brown eyes, so much like her father's, filled with concern. Maria quickly wiped her tears. "It's nothing, my love." But Lucia knew better. She had seen her mother cry over that same man's photo many times before. "Is it about my father again?" she asked. Maria froze. She had tried to shield Lucia from the truth, but the girl was too smart, too observant. "Yes," Maria finally admitted. "Your father is getting married today." Lucia's face hardened with determination. "Then we should go." "What?" "No, Lucia, we can't." "He promised he would come back for us," Lucia insisted. "He said he loved us." Maria's heart broke all over again. That was a long time ago, before he became who he is now. "I want to see him," Lucia said firmly. "I need to ask him why he never came back." Back at the wedding venue, guests filled the ornate chapel. Politicians, celebrities, and business magnates chatted amicably, all eager to witness the union of two of São Paulo's most elite figures. Isabella was in her dressing room, surrounded by bridesmaids fussing over her designer gown. At 35, she had waited for the perfect match, someone with the right combination of wealth, power, and status. Rodrigo was that man. "You're the luckiest woman in Brazil," her mother gushed. "Once you're Mrs. Albuquerque, every door will open for you." Isabella smiled tightly. "Yes, everything is perfect." Her maid of honor leaned in. "Except that you don't love him," she whispered. Isabella shot her a warning look. "Love is a luxury, Sophia. Security is what matters." Outside the chapel, Maria and Lucia had arrived after taking 2 buses across the city. They stood across the street, watching the glamorous guests enter. "We shouldn't be here," Maria said nervously, but Lucia was transfixed by the spectacle. "Which one is my father?" "He's inside already." "Lucia, please, let's go home." The little girl shook her head. "No, I need to see him." Before Maria could stop, Lucia broke free and ran across the street toward the chapel. Maria called after her, but her voice was lost in the noise of traffic and arriving guests. Inside, the ceremony was about to begin. The orchestra played as Rodrigo took his place at the altar. His father, Eduardo Albuquerque, the patriarch of the family, nodded approvingly from the front row. "You've done well, son," Eduardo had told him earlier. "This marriage will cement our family's position for generations." The music changed, signaling Isabella's entrance. The guests rose as the doors opened. But instead of the bride, a small figure dashed through, a little girl in a simple worn dress, her dark hair flying behind her. Security guards moved to intercept her, but she was quick and determined. Before anyone could stop her, she reached the altar where Rodrigo stood. The music stopped abruptly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rodrigo stared at the girl, confusion turning to shock as he looked into familiar brown eyes, his own eyes, in a smaller face. "Lucia?" he whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could. "Stop it." The girl's eyes widened. "You remember me?" The chapel fell silent. Everyone was watching, including Eduardo, whose face had turned to stone. "What is this?" Isabella demanded, having arrived at the entrance just in time to witness the scene. Lucia turned to face the assembled guests. Her small voice carried through the silent chapel. "My name is Lucia Oliveira. This man is my father." Gasps echoed through the chapel. Cameras flashed. Rodrigo stood frozen, his perfect world crumbling around him. "Rodrigo, what is she talking about?" Isabella hissed, advancing down the aisle, her white gown trailing behind her. He couldn't answer. His past, the one he'd buried under layers of wealth and ambition, had just crashed into his present. Maria appeared at the chapel doors, out of breath. "Lucia!" she called desperately. Rodrigo's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, 10 years melted away. Faria, the woman he'd once loved, the woman he'd abandoned when his father had threatened to disinherit him if he didn't end things with the cleaning girl. "Security! Remove them!" Eduardo commanded, rising from his seat. But Rodrigo raised his hand. "No, wait." He knelt down to Lucia's level, his expensive suit touching the floor. Up close, there was no denying it. She had his eyes, his mother's nose. "You promised you'd come back," Lucia said, her voice small but strong. "You promised, but you never did." The accusation hung in the air. Rodrigo felt hundreds of eyes on him, judging him. I'm sorry," he managed, the words inadequate even. As he spoke them, Isabella stepped forward, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. "You have a child? With her?" She pointed at Maria, who stood trembling at the back of the chapel. "I can explain," Rodrigo began, but Isabella cut him off. "Explain what? That you've been lying to me? That our entire relationship is built on deception?" The guests whispered among themselves. Phones were out, recording everything. Tomorrow, this would be in every newspaper, on every gossip site. "We need to talk about this privately," Rodrigo said, standing up. "There's nothing to talk about," Isabella snapped, pulling off her engagement ring and throwing it at him. "The wedding is off." She turned and stormed out, her bridesmaids hurrying after her. Eduardo approached his son, his voice low and dangerous. "Fix this now." But Rodrigo wasn't listening. He was looking at Lucia, at the daughter he'd abandoned, and at Maria, the woman whose heart he'd broken. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said to them, quietly enough that only they could hear. "Not a single day." Maria's expression hardened. "Save your lies, Rodrigo. We didn't come for your pity. Lucia wanted to see you, to understand why her father chose money over her." The words hit him like physical blows. "It wasn't like that," he protested weakly. "Then what was it like?" Maria challenged. "You disappeared from our lives without even saying goodbye. You changed your number, moved away. For 10 years, Lucia has grown up without a father, because you decided we weren't good enough for your new life." Lucia looked up at him, her eyes full of questions he had no answers for. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did you leave because of money?" Rodrigo felt sick. How could he explain to a 9-year-old that he'd been a coward, that he'd chosen his inheritance and social standing over the woman he loved and the child they'd created? Before he could answer, Eduardo stepped in. "This discussion is over. Miss, take your daughter and leave. Our lawyers will contact you." But Rodrigo had had enough of his father's control. "No," he said firmly. "They're not going anywhere." He turned to Maria. "Please give me a chance to make this right." "It's too late for that," Maria replied, taking Lucia's hand. "We've managed without you for 10 years. We'll manage for the rest of our lives." As they turned to leave, Rodrigo felt panic rising in his chest. He couldn't lose them again, not now, not like this. "Wait," he called out, "please, just wait." The chapel was still full of stunned guests, but Rodrigo no longer cared what they thought. All that mattered were the two people walking away from him. He ran after them, catching up at the chapel doors. "Maria, please. I know I don't deserve it, but give me one chance to explain." "Explain to your daughter," Maria said coldly. "She's the one who's suffered most from your absence." Rodrigo knelt down again, looking Lucia in the eyes. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice breaking. "The biggest mistake of my life, and I'm so sorry." "Did you ever love us?" Lucia asked, her voice small. "I never stopped loving you," Rodrigo said, tears filling his eyes. "I thought about you every day." "Then why didn't you come?" she pressed. The simple question had no simple answer. How could he tell her that he'd been weak, that he'd chosen the easy path, that he'd convinced himself they were better off without him? "Because I was afraid," he finally admitted. "I was afraid of disappointing my father, of losing everything I thought I wanted. But I was wrong, Lucia. So terribly wrong." Maria watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. After 10 years of raising their daughter alone, of struggling to make ends meet while he lived in luxury, could she ever forgive him? Outside the chapel, reporters had gathered, alerted by guests posting on social media. Cameras flashed as Rodrigo, Maria and Lucia emerged. "Mr. Albuquerque, is the wedding cancelled? Who is this child? Is she really your daughter?" Rodrigo looked at the chaos around them, then at Maria and Lucia. In that moment, he made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Yes," he said clearly, putting a protective arm around Lucia's shoulders. "This is my daughter, and I have a lot of making up to do." The headlines the next morning were merciless. "Billionaire's secret child crashes wedding," and "Albuquerque heir's double life exposed." Photos of Rodrigo with his arm around Lucia were everywhere, alongside images of a furious Isabella storming out of the chapel. In his penthouse apartment, Rodrigo paced back and forth, phone ringing constantly. He had ignored calls from his father, from business associates, and especially from Isabella. The only call he took was from Carlos, his best friend. "You've started a hurricane, my friend," Carlos said. "Eduardo is threatening to remove you from the company board." Rodrigo sighed. "I expected that. What are you going to do about Maria and the girl?" "Her name is Lucia," Rodrigo corrected him, "and I don't know yet, but I won't abandon them again." Across town, Maria and Lucia were dealing with their own chaos. Reporters camped outside their modest apartment building, shouting questions whenever anyone entered or left. "I shouldn't have let you go there," Maria told Lucia as they sat at their small kitchen table. "Now our lives will never be the same." Lucia looked down at her cereal. "I'm sorry, Mama. I just wanted to know why he never came back." Maria's heart ached. For years, she had protected Lucia from the truth about her father, that he had chosen wealth and status over them. She had worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner to provide for her daughter, never asking Rodrigo for a penny. "Don't apologize," Maria said, squeezing Lucia's hand. "You did nothing wrong." The doorbell rang, startling them both. Maria peeked through the peephole and was shocked to see Rodrigo standing there, wearing casual clothes instead of his usual expensive suits. "What do you want?" she asked after opening the door just a crack. "To talk," he said simply. "Please, Maria." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was clean but small, with furniture that had seen better days. Rodrigo took it all in, the stark contrast to his luxury penthouse hitting him hard. Lucia emerged from the kitchen and froze at the sight of her father. "Hello, Lucia," Rodrigo said, his voice gentle. "Hi," she replied cautiously. An awkward silence filled the room until Maria spoke. "Say what you came to say, Rodrigo." He took a deep breath. "I want to be part of Lucia's life. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try to make things right." Maria laughed bitterly. "After 10 years, you think you can just walk back in?" "No, I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "And what about your father, your company, your fiancé?" Maria challenged. Rodrigo's face hardened. "Isabella has made it clear our relationship is over. As for my father and the company, I'm dealing with that." Just then, the doorbell rang again. Maria checked and found a stern-looking older man in an expensive suit. Eduardo, she said, recognizing Rodrigo's father instantly. Miss Oliveira, he replied coldly. May I come in? Inside, Eduardo surveyed the apartment with thinly veiled disdain. His gaze landed on Lucia, and for a moment his expression softened. She has your mother's features, he told Rodrigo. Father, what are you doing here? Rodrigo asked. Eduardo straightened his tie. Damage control. The Albuquerque name is being dragged through the mud. I came to resolve this situation. He pulled out a checkbook. Miss Oliveira, I'm prepared to offer you a very generous settlement. In exchange, you and your daughter will sign a non-disclosure agreement and relocate to another city. Maria's eyes flashed with anger. We are not a situation to be resolved with your money. Everyone has a price, Eduardo insisted. Name yours. Rodrigo stepped between them. Stop it, father. This isn't why I came back into their lives. Then why did you, Eduardo demanded? To destroy everything our family has built? The company stock has already dropped 15% since yesterday because they're my family too, Rodrigo said firmly. Lucia is my daughter. Eduardo's face reddened. You chose your path 10 years ago. You chose the Albuquerque legacy. I made a mistake, Rodrigo admitted. The worst mistake of my life. Lucia, who had been quiet during the exchange, suddenly spoke up. Why didn't you want to meet me before? She asked Eduardo directly. The older man was taken aback by the child's directness. It wasn't about you, child. It was about what was. Best for the family. Am I not family? She asked innocently. Eduardo had no answer. For the first time in his life, the powerful businessman seemed at a loss for words. The tension was broken by another visitor, Isabella, who had somehow gotten past the reporters outside. So this is where you've been hiding, she said to Rodrigo, her eyes taking in the modest apartment and its occupants. Maria straightened her shoulders. If you're all going to have a family reunion, perhaps you should do it elsewhere. This is my home, not a conference room. Isabella ignored her, focusing on Rodrigo. You humiliated me in front of everyone who matters in São Paulo. I never meant to hurt you, Rodrigo said. Liar, Isabella spat. You knew about them all along. The accusation hung in the air. Lucia looked between the adults, confused and upset by the tension. I think you should all leave, Maria said firmly. This is too much for Lucia. Eduardo nodded. For once we agree. Come, Rodrigo. We have much to discuss. But Rodrigo didn't move. I'm staying. We need to talk. Just the three of us, he said, indicating Maria and Lucia. Isabella laughed bitterly. You're really choosing them over everything. Over me. Over your company. I should have chosen them 10 years ago, Rodrigo replied quietly. Eduardo's face hardened. If you stay, you're no longer an Albuquerque. I'll remove you from the board. Today. Then do it, Rodrigo said, not backing down. Eduardo and Isabella left, their expensive perfumes lingering in the small apartment. When the door closed behind them, silence fell. Maria sank onto the sofa, exhausted. You shouldn't have done that. It's what I should have done a decade ago, Rodrigo replied. Lucia looked at her father with new eyes. You chose us this time. The simple observation brought tears to Rodrigo's eyes. Yes, Lucia, I did. The next few days were a whirlwind. True to his word, Eduardo removed Rodrigo from the company board. The press continued their frenzy, digging into Maria's past and publishing unflattering stories, suggesting she had entrapped Rodrigo for his money. Through it all, Rodrigo stayed close to Maria and Lucia, getting to know his daughter and rediscovering the woman he had once loved. He rented an apartment nearby and visited daily, helping Lucia with homework, and taking them both out for meals away from the prying eyes of reporters. One evening, as Lucia was in her room, Rodrigo and Maria sat on her small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine. Why did you never contact me for child support? He asked. You struggled all these years. Maria looked out at the city lights. Pride, maybe, or anger. You chose your world over us so completely. I didn't want anything from that world touching Lucia. I've missed so much, Rodrigo said softly. Her first steps, first words. She walked early at 10 months, Maria told him, and her first word was mais, more. always hungry for everything: food, books, attention. Rodrigo smiled, then grew serious. Maria, I know I can never make up for the past, but I want to give Lucia the future she deserves, and... He hesitated. I want a chance to see if there's still something between us. Maria's expression hardened. Rodrigo, I'm not the same naive girl who fell in love with you. I've spent 10 years raising our daughter alone, working exhausting shifts, sacrificing everything. You can't just walk back in and expect me to fall into your arms. I know, he said. I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking for a chance to prove I've changed. Before she could respond, Lucia called from inside. Mama, someone's at the door. It was Carlos, Rodrigo's friend, looking troubled. You need to come quick, he told Rodrigo. There's an emergency board meeting. Eduardo is selling controlling interest in the company to Michael Torres. Michael Torres was Rodrigo's biggest rival, a ruthless businessman who had been trying to take over Albuquerque properties for years. He can't do that without my signature, Rodrigo said. He found a loophole, Carlos explained, but if you're there in person, you might be able to stop it. Rodrigo looked torn, glancing between Carlos and Maria. Go, Maria said. This is your legacy too. I'll be back, Rodrigo promised. This isn't like before. At Albuquerque headquarters, the boardroom was tense. Eduardo sat at the head of the table, with Michael Torres at his right hand. When Rodrigo entered, Eduardo's expression darkened. You're not welcome here, he said. You're no longer on the board. As the heir to the Albuquerque estate, I have a right to be present for any major decision, Rodrigo countered, having consulted his own lawyers. Michael Torres smiled thinly. Family drama? How tedious. You're selling to our biggest competitor? Rodrigo addressed his father. You'd destroy our family company just to punish me? You destroyed it when you chose that woman and her child over your responsibilities, Eduardo snapped. Her child is your granddaughter, Rodrigo shot back. Your flesh and blood, and her name is Lucia. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Many had worked with the Albuquerque family for decades. The meeting is about to begin, Eduardo said dismissively. Rodrigo looked around the table. Before you vote, there's something you should know. I've filed for a temporary injunction against any sale of company shares. My lawyers submitted it. This afternoon, Eduardo's face went purple with rage. You what? I'm protecting our family legacy, Father. From you. The board meeting dissolved into chaos. As legal arguments flew back and forth, Rodrigo slipped out, texting Carlos to keep him updated. There was somewhere more important he needed to be. Back at Maria's apartment, he found her and Lucia playing a board game at the kitchen table. The domestic scene, so normal, so precious, made his heart ache for all the years he'd missed. That was quick, Maria remarked. I realized something, Rodrigo said, taking a seat at the table. All these years I thought the company was my legacy. But it's not. She is. He nodded toward Lucia. What about your father? The meeting? Carlos will handle it. I've done what I can legally. The rest isn't worth missing another minute with Lucia. Maria studied him, trying to determine if this was really the same man who had abandoned them years ago. The Rodrigo she had known had been ambitious and driven, always putting business first. This man before her seemed different, softer, more genuine. As if reading her thoughts, Rodrigo said, I meant what I said earlier, Maria. I want a chance to prove I've changed, to be the father Lucia deserves, and maybe someday to be worthy of you again. Before she could respond, Lucia, who had been pretending not to listen, chimed in. Does that mean you're staying, Papa? It was the first time she had called him that, and Rodrigo felt tears spring to his eyes. Yes, Lucia, I'm staying. Later that night, after Lucia had gone to bed, Rodrigo and Maria sat together on the sofa. It won't be easy, Maria warned. Your world and mine are very different. They don't have to be, Rodrigo said. I don't need the penthouse or the company. I saved enough over the years to start over. And your father? Rodrigo's expression turned sad. He'll either accept my decision or he won't, but I can't let him control my life anymore. Maria hesitated, then slowly placed her hand over his. One day at a time. Rodrigo, that's all I can promise. It was more than he deserved, and he knew it. One day at a time, he agreed. As he left that night, promising to return the next day, Rodrigo felt lighter than he had in years. The scandal, the company, the society pages, none of it mattered compared to what he'd found in that small apartment, the family he should never have given up. But outside in his car, a text from Carlos brought him crashing back to reality. Emergency. Eduardo in hospital. Heart attack during meeting. Come quickly. Rodrigo stared at the message, a cold dread washing over him. In his determination to forge a new path, had he pushed his father too far? And if Eduardo didn't survive, could Rodrigo ever forgive himself? With a heavy heart, he started the car and headed to the hospital, unaware that this was just the beginning of a struggle that would test his newfound commitment to Maria and Lucia in ways he couldn't imagine. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse, Isabella was having a drink with Michael Torres. "Did it work?" she asked. "Is the deal going through?" Michael smiled coldly. "It would have, if not for Rodrigo's injunction. But Eduardo's heart attack changes everything. If he doesn't recover, Rodrigo becomes the controlling shareholder," Isabella finished. Unless someone has a prior claim," Michael agreed. "Like, perhaps, a fiancé with a pre-signed marriage contract." Isabella swirled her champagne. "The wedding may have been called off, but the contract was never formally dissolved." Their glasses clinked together in a silent toast to their shared ambition. Neither of them had any intention of letting Rodrigo walk away to play happy families. The Albuquerque fortune was too tempting a prize. And in the hospital waiting room, Rodrigo was about to discover just how difficult choosing his new path would really be. The hospital corridor was eerily quiet at 3 in the morning. Rodrigo sat alone outside the intensive care unit, his head in his hands. Eduardo's condition was critical. The heart attack had been severe and the doctors weren't making any promises. Carlos had gone for coffee, leaving Rodrigo with his thoughts. How quickly life could change. Just days ago, he had been about to marry Isabella. Now his father was fighting for his life. His position at the company was in jeopardy, and he was trying to build a relationship with a daughter who had grown up without him. "Mr. Albuquerque?" Rodrigo looked up to see a doctor approaching. "Yes? How is he?" "Stable for now. The next 24 hours will be crucial." "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "Briefly. He's sedated, but he might be able to hear you." In the ICU, Eduardo looked small and fragile, surrounded by machines monitoring his vital signs. Rodrigo had never seen his father look vulnerable before. Eduardo Albuquerque had always been larger than life, intimidating, demanding, unstoppable. "Father," Rodrigo said softly, taking the older man's hand. "I'm here. You need to fight." There was no response, just the steady beep of the heart monitor. "I know we don't agree right now, but you're still my father. I still need you." A nurse appeared at the door. "Mr. Albuquerque, there's someone insisting on seeing you. She says she's your fiancé." Rodrigo frowned. "Isabella is here?" Outside, he found Isabella looking immaculate despite the hour. Not a hair. Out of place. "How is he?" she asked, her voice carrying just the right note of concern. "Critical. What are you doing here, Isabella?" "I thought we were done." She placed a manicured hand on his arm. "We had a fight, Rodrigo. It doesn't erase our history. Besides, Eduardo is like a father to me. I care about him." Rodrigo was too exhausted to argue. "Thank you for coming, but there's nothing you can do right now." "Actually, there is." She lowered her voice. "Michael Torres is moving quickly. With Eduardo incapacitated, he's approaching other board members individually. He's offering them deals they can't refuse." "How do you know this?" Isabella hesitated. "I have my sources. The point is, you need to act now if you want to save your family's company." Rodrigo studied her face. There was something she wasn't telling him. "Why do you care what happens to Albuquerque Properties now?" "Because, despite everything, I care about you," she said, her eyes meeting his. "And I know how much the company means to you." Before he could respond, his phone rang. It was Maria. "Rodrigo, I saw the news about your father. How is he?" The genuine concern in her voice touched him. "Not good. They're saying the next day is critical. I'm sorry, Maria said. Lucia was asking about you. She was worried when you didn't call to say goodnight. Guilt washed over him. In the chaos of the emergency, he had forgotten his promise to call Lucia. Tell her I'm sorry, I'll make it up to her tomorrow. We understand. Family comes first. The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. For too long, family had only meant the Albuquerque name and legacy, not the woman he had loved or the child they had created. Maria, he said, suddenly needing to hear her voice a little longer. Thank you for calling. Get some rest if you can, she replied gently. Good night, Rodrigo. When he hung up, he found Isabella watching him with a calculating expression. The cleaning lady, she said coldly. Still keeping you on a short leash, I see. Her name is Maria, Rodrigo snapped, and she's the mother of my child. A child you didn't acknowledge for 10 years, Isabella reminded him. Don't pretend you're father of the year now, the barb struck home. I'm trying to make things right, and in the process you're letting everything your father built slip away, she countered. Is that really what you want? No, it wasn't. Despite their differences, Rodrigo respected what his father had accomplished. Albuquerque Properties had been founded by his grandfather and grown under Eduardo's leadership. It was supposed to be Rodrigo's legacy to continue. What do you suggest? He asked. Isabella moved closer. Come back to the board. Fight Torres. We can say the wedding is still on. It will stabilize the company's image while Eduardo recovers. Pretend. We're still engaged. After what happened. For the sake of the company, she insisted. For your father. Rodrigo was saved from answering by Carlos's return. His friend took one look at Isabella and frowned. The vultures are circling already, Carlos muttered. Isabella shot him an icy glare. I'm here to support Rodrigo. Sure you are, Carlos replied skeptically. Rodrigo, there are some papers you need to sign if you want to challenge Torres's moves. The next morning, after a sleepless night at the hospital, Rodrigo went directly to Maria's apartment. He found her getting Lucia ready for school, both of them surprised to see him so early. Papa, Lucia exclaimed, running to hug him. The easy way she had accepted him into her life humbled him. I promised I'd see you today, he said, hugging her back. Maria looked at him with concern. You look terrible. Have you slept? Not really, he admitted. Father is still unconscious. Lucia looked worried. Is your papa going to be okay? I hope so, sweetie, Rodrigo replied, touched by her concern for a grandfather she had never met. Can we visit him? Lucia asked. Maybe if he meets me, he won't be so angry with you. Rodrigo exchanged a look with Maria, who shrugged slightly. It's up to you, she said. She's been asking all night. It might not be the best time, Rodrigo said gently, but maybe when he's feeling better. After Lucia left for school, Rodrigo collapsed onto Maria's sofa. Everything is falling apart, he confessed. Torres is trying to take over the company. Isabella wants to pretend we're still engaged to stabilize things. And what do you want? Maria asked. Rodrigo looked at her. Really? Looked at her. At 40, Maria was still beautiful, with streaks of silver in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when they were together. She had raised their daughter alone, never complaining, never asking for help. Her strength amazed him. I want to do the right thing, he said. For once in my life, Maria sat beside him. The right thing isn't always clear, Rodrigo. Only you can decide what that means for you. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes. If I abandon the company, hundreds of people could lose their jobs. If Torres takes over, he's known for stripping companies and selling the parts. So it's not just about money or your father's approval. No, Rodrigo said. It's about responsibility. These people depend on Albuquerque Properties for their livelihoods. Maria was quiet for a moment. Then maybe you need to find a way to be there for everyone who needs you, your employees, your father, and Lucia. And you? He asked, looking at her. Where do you fit in this equation? A small smile played on her lips. I've managed on my own for a long time, Rodrigo. I'm not the one who needs you right now. But he needed her. Her wisdom, her strength, her forgiveness. He just wasn't sure how to tell her. Back at the hospital later that day, Rodrigo found Unexpected visitor in his father's room. Michael Torres sat beside Eduardo's bed, speaking in low tones to the unconscious man. "What are you doing here?" Rodrigo demanded. Torres stood smoothly, buttoning his designer jacket. "Paying my respects to a business rival. Your father and I have known each other for 30 years. Get out," Rodrigo said. "Now." Torres smiled coldly. Such hostility. And here I was, about to offer you a generous deal for your family's company, one that would allow you to keep a seat on the board. I'm not selling to you. Your father was more receptive before his as unfortunate episode. Torres moved toward the door. The offer won't stay open forever. Think about it, Rodrigo. You could cash out, set up a nice trust fund for your newly discovered daughter, and walk away from all this stress. After Torres left, Rodrigo sank into the chair, studying his father's face. Had Eduardo really been planning to sell to their biggest rival? It seemed impossible. A slight movement caught his eye, Eduardo's fingers twitching. Then his eyelids fluttered. "Father?" Rodrigo leaned forward. "Can you hear me?" Eduardo's eyes opened slightly. He tried to speak but couldn't with the breathing tube. Instead, he raised his hand weakly, grasping for Rodrigo. Rodrigo took his hand. "I'm here. You're going to be okay." Eduardo shook his head slightly, then made a writing motion. Rodrigo quickly found a notepad and pen, holding it where his father could scribble a shaky message. "Don't trust Torres, I don't," Rodrigo assured him. "The company is safe. Just focus on getting better," Eduardo scribbled again. "Isabella, involved." A cold feeling settled in Rodrigo's stomach. Involved how? With Torres. But Eduardo's strength was fading. His eyes closed, and the pen fell from his fingers. The monitors showed he was still stable, just exhausted from the brief awakening. Rodrigo stared at the cryptic words. Was his father delirious? Or was Isabella somehow working with Torres? It seemed far-fetched, but then again, she had known suspiciously. Detailed information about Torres's moves. His phone rang, Carlos again. "We have a problem. Legal just found a document giving Isabella power of attorney for Eduardo in case of medical incapacitation. It was signed the day before your wedding." "That's impossible," Rodrigo said. "My father would never do that." "Well, his signature is on it, and she's using it to call an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning." Suddenly, Eduardo's warning made terrible sense. Isabella and Torres were working together, and they had somehow manipulated his father into signing a document that gave Isabella control while he was incapacitated. "I need to find her," Rodrigo said. "Now." But Isabella wasn't answering her phone. Rodrigo drove to her penthouse, only to be told by the doorman that she had left with luggage earlier that day. Desperate for answers, he went to the one person he knew might be able to help, his father's longtime secretary, Helena. "I need to know everything about my father's meetings with Torres and Isabella in the weeks before the wedding," he told her. Helena looked uncomfortable. "Your father swore me to secrecy." "Helena, please. The company is at stake." She hesitated, then sighed. "They had several private meetings. I wasn't in the room, but I heard arguments. The last time I saw Miss Mora leave with papers, she looked very pleased with herself. Did my father seem himself, or was he confused?" Helena's expression changed. "Now that you mention it, he had been complaining of feeling strange after taking new medication his doctor prescribed." A sick feeling grew in Rodrigo's stomach. "Who was this doctor?" "Someone new." "Dr. Rivera, I think. Your father only saw him a few times." Rodrigo made some calls. There was no Dr. Rivera with privileges at any of the hospitals Eduardo usually frequented. It was looking more and more like his father had been deliberately drugged to make him suggestible enough to sign papers giving Isabella power of attorney. As night fell, Rodrigo found himself driving to Maria's apartment again. He needed to talk to someone he could trust completely, someone who would see the situation clearly. Maria listened without interrupting as he laid out everything he had discovered. When he finished, she shook her head. "If what you suspect is true, it's criminal. You need to go to the police." "With what evidence? A scribbled note from my semi-conscious father? A secretary's vague recollections?" "Then what will you do?" Rodrigo leaned forward. I need to be at that board meeting tomorrow. I need to confront Isabella directly. Be careful, Maria warned. If she's desperate enough to drug your father, there's no telling what else she might do. The concern in her voice warmed him. I will. As he stood to leave, Maria caught his hand. Rodrigo, Lucia has a school play tomorrow afternoon. She's playing a tree. She smiled slightly. Not a big role, but she's excited. She wants you to be there. The timing couldn't be worse. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. and could run for hours, but the hopeful look in Maria's eyes made it impossible to refuse. I'll be there, he promised, no matter what happens at the meeting. Early the next morning, Rodrigo arrived at Albuquerque headquarters to find Carlos waiting for him in the lobby. She's already upstairs with Torres, Carlos reported. Most of the board members have arrived too. What about the document, I asked. The lawyers to prepare. Carlos handed him a folder. It's all here, but are you sure about this? It's a big decision. I'm sure, Rodrigo said firmly. In the boardroom, all conversation stopped when Rodrigo entered. Isabella sat at the head of the table, his father's seat, with Torres beside her. She wore a conservative black dress, playing the role of the concerned, almost daughter-in-law perfectly. Rodrigo, she said smoothly, I'm glad you could join us. We were just about to start. Before you do, Rodrigo said, I have something to say. He looked around the table at the board members, most of whom had known him since childhood. My father is still fighting for his life. The circumstances that led to his heart attack and to this meeting are suspicious at best, criminal at worst. Isabella's smile faltered slightly. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, I'm stating facts. The power of attorney document you're using to call this meeting was signed while my father was being given medication by a doctor who doesn't exist. A murmur went around the table. Torres leaned forward. These are serious accusations, Rodrigo. Do you have proof? The police are looking into it as we speak, Rodrigo bluffed. He hadn't actually gone to the police yet, but Torres and Isabella didn't know that. Isabella's composure slipped further. This is ridiculous. Eduardo trusted me to act in his best interests. Did he trust you to conspire with our biggest competitor? Rodrigo countered, nodding toward Torres. The boardroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Torres stood up. I think we should adjourn this meeting until these wild allegations can be addressed properly. Sit down, Michael, Rodrigo commanded. You're not going anywhere until we finish this. To everyone's surprise, Torres did sit, though his expression was murderous. Rodrigo opened the folder Carlos had given him. I have here a document transferring all of my father's voting shares to me, effective immediately. It was signed yesterday when he briefly regained consciousness, witnessed by his doctor and a lawyer. It was a gamble. The document was real, but Eduardo had been barely conscious when he signed it. Still, it was enough to create doubt about Isabella's power of attorney. This is outrageous, Isabella sputtered. You can't do this. I already have, Rodrigo replied calmly. And as the new majority shareholder, my first act is to remove you from this building. Security is waiting outside to escort you and Mr. Torres out. Right on cue, 2 security guards entered the boardroom. Rodrigo had called in a favor from the head of security, who had always been loyal to the Albuquerque family. Isabella stood, her face contorted with rage. You'll regret this, Rodrigo. I have evidence, emails, recordings of your father agreeing to sell to Torres. Obtained while he was being drugged, Rodrigo countered. Not exactly admissible in court, is it? Torres placed a restraining hand on Isabella's arm. Let's go. This isn't over, Rodrigo. As they were led out, Rodrigo addressed the remaining board members. I know this is unusual, but I assure you I'm acting in the best interests of this company and my father. I'd like to call for a vote of confidence. One by one, the board members voiced their support. Most had known Rodrigo since he was a boy and trusted him more than they would ever trust an outsider like Torres. By noon, the crisis had been temporarily averted. Rodrigo was officially acting as CEO while Eduardo recovered. The company stock, which had been plummeting, stabilized when the news was announced, but Rodrigo had no time to celebrate. He looked at his watch. Lucia's play started in 30 minutes and the school was across town. Carlos, can you handle things here? He asked his friend. Where are you going? We still have the press to deal with. "I made a promise to my daughter," Rodrigo said, "and this time I'm keeping it." He made it to the school auditorium just as the lights were dimming. Maria, sitting near the front, looked surprised when he slid into the seat next to her. "You made it," she whispered. "I said I would," he replied, taking her hand. "I'm done breaking promises to the people I care about." On stage, Lucia stood proudly in her tree costume, her face lighting up when she spotted Rodrigo in the audience. It wasn't a major Broadway production, just a simple elementary school play about the environment. But watching his daughter perform, even as a silent tree, filled Rodrigo with more pride than any business deal ever had. Afterward, as they waited for Lucia to change out of her costume, Maria studied him. "From your face, I'd say the meeting went well. For now," Rodrigo said, "but Torres and Isabella won't give up easily. At least you bought some time." Lucia bounded out, still flushed with excitement from the performance. "You came," she exclaimed, hugging Rodrigo tightly. "Of course I did," he said. "You were the best tree I've ever seen," she giggled. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?" "Absolutely." As they walked toward the exit, Rodrigo's phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Albuquerque? You need to come quickly. Your father is asking for you." Rodrigo's heart raced. "Is he worse?" "No, he's fully conscious, but he's very agitated. He says he needs to tell you something important, something about Ms. Mora and Mr. Torres." Rodrigo looked at Maria and Lucia, torn between his father's urgent summons and the ice cream outing he had just promised his daughter. Maria made the decision for him. "Go," she said gently. "Your father needs you. We'll have ice cream another day." Lucia looked disappointed but nodded bravely. "Tell your papa I hope he feels better." At the hospital, Rodrigo found Eduardo sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. The breathing tube had been removed. "Son," Eduardo said, his voice weak but urgent. "They tried to trick me. Torres and that woman. They're after the Copacabana property." The Copacabana property was the crown jewel of Albuquerque Holdings, prime beachfront real estate worth billions. "How?" Rodrigo asked. "Offshore company, shell corporations," Eduardo struggled to explain. "In my desk, red folder, evidence." Rodrigo squeezed his father's hand. "Don't worry, I'll find it. You just rest and get better." Eduardo held his gaze. "I was wrong about the girl." "Lucia?" Eduardo nodded. "Bring her. Want to meet my granddaughter." Tears pricked Rodrigo's eyes. "I will." As he left the hospital, Rodrigo felt both relief and determination. His father was recovering and had apparently had a change of heart about Lucia. And now Rodrigo knew exactly what Torres and Isabella had been after all along. But as he drove toward his father's mansion to search for the red folder, he didn't notice the black car that pulled out to follow him. Inside sat Isabella, her face set in determination. "Stay on him," she instructed the driver. "He's going to lead us right to those documents." The final confrontation was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher, not just for the Albuquerque empire, but for Rodrigo's newfound family as well. The Albuquerque mansion stood silent in the fading evening light. Rodrigo used his old key to enter, memories flooding back with each step he took. This had been his home for most of his life, but now it felt strange, almost foreign. He headed straight for his father's study, a place that had been off-limits to him as a child. The massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface meticulously organized. Rodrigo began opening drawers, searching for the red folder his father had mentioned. The first few drawers yielded nothing but routine paperwork, but when he tried the bottom drawer, he found it locked. Looking for something? Rodrigo spun around to find Isabella standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "How did you get in here?" he demanded. "I still have a key," she replied smoothly. "Eduardo gave it to me months ago. We were going to be family after all." Rodrigo stood, placing himself between her and the desk. "Not anymore. You need to leave." "Not without what I came for." Her polished facade had disappeared, revealing the cold ambition beneath. "I've worked too hard to walk away empty-handed." "The Copacabana property," Rodrigo said. "That's what this is all about, isn't it?" Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Eduardo told you." Enough to know you and Torres cooked up this whole scheme to get your hands on it. You never cared about me or my father." She laughed bitterly. "Oh, I cared. I spent 2 years of my life playing the devoted fiancé. Do you know how boring that was? Listening to you talk about construction permits and profit margins? So it was all an act." "Not at first," Isabella admitted. "Initially, I was attracted to your money and position, but then Torres offered me a better deal. And drugging my father. Was that part of the better deal too?" A flicker of something, perhaps guilt, crossed her face before vanishing. "That was Torres's idea. Just something to make Eduardo more agreeable during negotiations." "You could have killed him," Rodrigo said angrily. "Don't be so dramatic. It was just meant to make him suggestible. The heart attack was an unfortunate coincidence." Rodrigo stepped closer. "I want you out of our lives. If you leave now, I won't press charges." Isabella smiled coldly. "You won't press charges anyway. You can't prove anything, and you won't risk a public scandal that would tank the company's stock." She was right, and they both knew it. Even with Eduardo's testimony, it would be hard to prove what they'd done, and the publicity would be devastating for Albuquerque properties. "What do you want?" Rodrigo asked wearily. "The red folder," she said. "I know Eduardo keeps records of everything. Whatever evidence he has against us is in that folder." "And if I give it to you?" "Torres and I disappear from your life. We go. Back to a simple business rivalry, nothing more." Rodrigo considered his options. He could call security, but by the time they arrived, Isabella might find the folder herself. He could try to physically remove her from the house, but that would likely end badly. "I don't know where the folder is," he said truthfully. Isabella moved toward the desk. "Then we'll look together." Before either of them could make another move, a voice came from the doorway. "I believe this is what you're looking for." They both turned to see Maria standing there holding a red folder. "Maria?" Rodrigo was stunned. "What are you doing here?" "Lucia left her backpack in your car this afternoon. When I came to return your keys, I saw her." Maria nodded toward Isabella, "following you inside. Given what you told me about her, I thought you might need help." Isabella's eyes fixed on the folder. "Give me that." "I don't think so," Maria replied calmly. "I've already looked inside. Very interesting documents, offshore accounts, fake companies, even records of payments to a Dr. Rivera. You have no right to interfere," Isabella snarled, her composure completely gone now. "This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with her," Rodrigo said, moving to stand beside Maria. "You threatened my family, all of my family." Isabella looked between them, calculating her next move. "You're making a mistake. Torres has connections you can't imagine. He can ruin you." "Not with this evidence," Maria said, holding up the folder. "I made copies before coming here. If anything happens to any of us, these documents go straight to the police and the press." For the first time, genuine fear showed in Isabella's eyes. "You're bluffing. Try me," Maria said steadily. "I've spent 10 years protecting my daughter. Do you really think I'd hesitate to protect her from you?" The standoff continued for a tense moment. Then Isabella's shoulders slumped slightly. "Fine. Keep the folder. But this isn't over." "Yes, it is," Rodrigo said firmly. "I want you out of this house and out of our lives now." As Isabella stormed out, Maria handed Rodrigo the folder. "You should look at this. It's worse than you thought. They were planning to strip the company completely." Rodrigo took the folder but didn't open it. Instead, he looked at Maria with newfound admiration. "How did you find this?" She smiled slightly. "It wasn't hard. Eduardo's desk has the same lock as the supply cabinets at the hospital where I work, and I had a feeling a man like him would keep important documents close at hand." "You're amazing," Rodrigo said softly. "Thank you." "I did it for Lucia," Maria replied. "And for you. You've been trying so hard to do the right thing." The moment was interrupted by Rodrigo's phone ringing. It was the hospital again. "Mr. Albuquerque, your father is asking to see you and a young girl named Lucia. He's quite insistent." Rodrigo looked at Maria questioningly. She hesitated, then nodded. "If you think it's a good idea." "We'll be there soon," Rodrigo told the nurse. On the drive to the hospital, Rodrigo explained to Lucia who they were going to see. "Your grandfather is sick, but he wants to meet you," he said gently. Lucia looked thoughtful. The one who didn't want you to be my papa? Yes, Rodrigo admitted. But people can change their minds, like you did, she said simply. The wisdom in her young voice touched him deeply. Exactly like I did. At the hospital, they found Eduardo sitting up in bed, looking tired but alert. His eyes widened when he saw Lucia. So this is my granddaughter, he said, his voice rough from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. Lucia approached the bed cautiously. Hello, I'm Lucia. Eduardo studied her face. You look like your grandmother, my wife. She would have loved to meet you. Papa says you were sick, Lucia said. Are you feeling better? A hint of a smile touched Eduardo's lips. A little better. Now. Maria hung back by the door, wanting to give them space, but Eduardo noticed her. You must be Maria, he said. Come closer. Reluctantly, Maria approached the bed. Mr. Albuquerque, I owe you an apology, Eduardo said, surprising them all. 10 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I thought I was protecting my family's legacy, but I was really just being a stubborn old man. Rodrigo had never heard his father apologize. For anything, not once in his entire life. Father, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Eduardo interrupted. The heart attack showed me something important. All the money and power in the world means nothing if you're alone at the end. He turned his attention back to Lucia. I've missed 10 years of your life. I'd like a chance to make up for that if you'll let me. Lucia considered this with a child's directness. Do you have cookies at your house? Eduardo laughed, then winced at the pain in his chest. I'm sure we can arrange for cookies. Then I think it's okay, she decided. For the next hour, Lucia chatted. Away, telling her newly discovered grandfather all about school, her friends, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. Eduardo listened with rapt attention, occasionally glancing at Rodrigo with an expression that seemed to say, She's remarkable. When a nurse came to announce that visiting hours were ending, Eduardo asked for a moment alone with Rodrigo. I found the folder, Rodrigo told him once Maria and Lucia had stepped outside. Actually, Maria found it. Smart woman, Eduardo commented. What will you do with it? I'm not sure yet. Use it as leverage to keep Torres away from the company at least. Eduardo nodded. Good, but there's something else we need to discuss. He took a labored breath. I'm not coming back to the company, Rodrigo. Oh, what, of course you are, once you're recovered. No, Eduardo said firmly. This heart attack was a warning. I'm 72 years old. It's time for me to step aside. But the company will be yours to run, as it should have been for some time now. Eduardo's eyes held his son's. You've proven you're ready. The way you handled Torres and Isabella showed me that. Rodrigo was stunned. His father had always insisted that he wasn't ready for full control of Albuquerque properties. There's more, Eduardo continued. I want you to set up a trust for Lucia, a significant one. She deserves her share of the family fortune. Thank you, Rodrigo said, deeply moved. That means a lot. And Maria, Eduardo asked, what are your intentions there? Rodrigo hesitated. I'm not sure. We're taking things slowly. Don't wait too long, his father advised. I wasted years with your mother, always thinking we had more time. Then suddenly she was gone. Outside in the hallway, Maria was helping. Lucia get a snack from the vending machine when she spotted a familiar face, Michael Torres striding purposefully toward Eduardo's room. Lucia, stay right here, Maria instructed, hurrying back to intercept him. She reached the door just as Torres was about to enter. Excuse me, Mr. Torres, visiting hours are ending. He looked at her with contempt. And who might you be? Someone who has copies of every document in that red folder you're so interested in, Maria replied quietly. Torres's expression froze. What are you talking about? Offshore accounts, fake medical credentials, drugging Eduardo Albuquerque. Does any of that sound familiar? His eyes narrowed. Isabella, he muttered. I knew she'd bungle it. I suggest you leave, Maria said, unless you want to explain to hospital security why you're visiting the man you tried to kill. Torres glanced through the door's window, where he could see Rodrigo and Eduardo deep in conversation. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Maria insisted. If anything happens to Rodrigo, Eduardo, or Albuquerque properties, those documents go public. Your reputation would never recover. He studied her face, seemingly surprised by her resolve. You're just a cleaning woman. How did you get mixed up in all this? I'm a mother protecting her family, Maria corrected him. That makes me more dangerous than you can imagine. Something in her tone must have convinced him. After a moment, Torres nodded curtly and walked away. When Rodrigo emerged from his father's room, he found Maria waiting alone. Where's Lucia? He asked, with the nurse. She's showing her how the heart monitors work, Maria explained. Torres was here. Rodrigo's expression darkened. What did he want? To cause trouble, I imagine. But I sent him away. She briefly explained their conversation. Rodrigo stared at her in amazement. You stood up to Torres. Most business executives are terrified of him, Maria shrugged. I've dealt with worse hospital administrators. He laughed, then impulsively pulled her into a hug. After a moment of surprise, she relaxed into his embrace. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, for everything. 3 months later, the gardens of the Albuquerque estate were transformed once again. But unlike the stiff, formal wedding that had been planned with Isabella, this gathering was smaller and more intimate. Eduardo, still moving slowly but recovering well, sat in a place of honor as Lucia dashed around the garden, wearing a flower, crown and directing the other children in an improvised game. She's a natural leader, Eduardo observed to Rodrigo, who stood nearby. Just like you were at that age. Rodrigo smiled. The past months had brought many changes. He had taken full control of Albuquerque properties, with Eduardo serving as an advisor when needed. Torres had retreated to his own business interests, the threat of exposure keeping him at bay. Isabella had left the country, apparently now living in Europe on Torres's dime. Most importantly, Rodrigo had moved into a new home, not as grand as his penthouse or the family mansion, but spacious and comfortable, with a room decorated especially for Lucia for her weekend visits. He and Maria were taking things slowly, rebuilding the trust that had been broken a decade ago. Papa, Lucia called, running over. Is it time yet? Almost, Rodrigo assured her. Are you ready? She nodded eagerly. I've been practicing. Maria approached, looking beautiful in a simple blue dress. Everything's ready, she told Rodrigo. The guests gathered around a small table where a birthday cake waited. Today was Lucia's 10th birthday, the first one Rodrigo had ever been present for. As everyone sang Happy Birthday, Rodrigo watched his daughter's face glowing with happiness. Maria stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. When the song ended, Eduardo spoke up. Before we cut the cake, I have an announcement. All eyes turned to him as he stood with the help of his cane. Today, I'm officially retiring from all involvement with Albuquerque properties, he said. The company is now entirely in Rodrigo's capable hands. There was a smattering of applause. This wasn't unexpected. Eduardo had been gradually withdrawing from business affairs since his heart attack. And, he continued, I've decided to do something else with my time. I'm establishing the Lucia Albuquerque Foundation, which will provide educational opportunities for underprivileged children throughout Brazil. Lucia's eyes widened. A foundation with my name? Eduardo nodded. Your father tells me you want to help animals when you grow up. This foundation will help children follow their dreams, just like you're following yours. The gathered friends and family applauded more enthusiastically this time. Lucia hugged her grandfather, no longer tentative around him. As cake was being served, Rodrigo drew Maria aside. There's something I want to ask you, he said, suddenly nervous. Maria looked at him expectantly. Yes? These past months have shown me what truly matters. Being with you and Lucia, building a real family. It's all I want. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Rodrigo, Maria said, her voice cautious. We agreed to take things slowly. I know, and if you're not ready, I understand. But I wanted you to know that I'm sure about us. He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. I don't want a big wedding or a society event. I just want you, if you'll have me. Maria looked at the ring, then at Rodrigo's face. For you know it won't be easy. We come from different worlds. Not anymore, he said. My world is wherever you and Lucia are. Tears filled her eyes. I never stopped loving you, she admitted, even when I wanted to. Is that a yes? He asked hopefully. Instead of answering, she kissed him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Ooh, they're kissing. Lucia's voice interrupted them. She stood nearby, wrinkling her nose but looking pleased nonetheless. Maria laughed, wiping away her tears. Yes, we are. Does this mean you're going to get married? Lucia asked. Rodrigo looked at Maria questioningly. She took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger. Yes, she said, her eyes never leaving Rodrigo's. We are. Eduardo approached, leaning on his cane. It's about time, he said gruffly, but his eyes were warm. Welcome to the family, Maria, officially this time. Later, as the party continued around them, Rodrigo found a quiet moment with his father. Are you really okay with all this? He asked. Eduardo looked at Maria, who was helping Lucia and her friends with a game. 10 years ago, I thought I knew what was best for this family. I was wrong, and it cost all of us dearly. He placed a hand on Rodrigo's shoulder. Don't make the same mistake. Never put anything above the people you love. Across the garden, Maria looked up and caught Rodrigo's eye. She smiled, and in that smile, he saw their future. Not perfect, perhaps, but real and true. The path ahead would have its challenges. There would be adjustments as they blended their lives, questions from society circles, and the ongoing need to protect Albuquerque properties from people like Torres. But for the first time in his life, Rodrigo felt complete. The truth that had been revealed at the altar, that fateful day, had changed everything. What had seemed like the end of his carefully planned life had actually been the beginning of something far more precious. As Lucia ran up and grabbed both his and Maria's hands, pulling them toward the games, Rodrigo knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found his true legacy, not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the love of the family he had almost lost forever. The end.